Hey guys, welcome to this Digital Society tutorial on puppetry. In this video we're going to be discussing the topic of puppetry, incorporating some stuff that we mentioned a couple of weeks ago in our puppetry session, and then also some stuff that we were going to talk about in our another session, but that unfortunately had to be cancelled due to situations involving the coronavirus pandemic and the resulting lockdown. So let's get into it. So what is puppetry? Puppetry is a form of theatre or performance that involves inanimate objects that are then brought to life by actors, in this case called puppeteers. These inanimate objects can take the form of animals or humanoids or really anything that the creator's imagination can take form. Probably the most famous example is Warhorse. So the titular horse in Warhorse is this large two-man puppet that is designed to look like a horse and is operated in such a way as to convince the audience that it is a horse, despite the fact that it is just a construct of wood and metal. How is puppetry used? Puppetry can be used, as I mentioned, in any number of ways. So most traditionally you'll see it used in the form of animals or humans, so it can be used to represent snakes or horses or birds, or it can be used to represent small children, elderly people, or be used in kind of flashback sequences to represent dreams, but it can also be used to represent ghosts or robots or anything that you can really think about. That's one of the joys of it. It is really only restricted by your imagination. So for example, I did an exercise with the National Theatre in which we built puppets out of rubbish. So we built this giant four-legged monster, we built an army of snakes, we built I can't remember what the other group built. They built these kind of like two-legged little kind of dog-like creatures, and the challenge was actually working out their personalities, and that's where the real fun of puppetry lies, is working out who the character of the puppet is once you've built it and learnt how to operate it. Speaking of operating it, how do you puppet? So I'm not going to go into the full details of how to do this in a video, because it is really something that should be done in person. And I'll link some videos below that will show you some really good techniques and ways of building puppets, but for the scope of this video I'm only going to introduce you to the basics. There are a few key things you've got to remember when puppeting. First thing is your stance. So you've got to keep your feet shoulder width apart and your knees slightly bent. This is so that you have a strong foundation which you hopefully will not be able to move from, and then when you need to move, you can move from it quickly and efficiently, so you are not drawing attention away from the puppet. This takes a lot of practice because it is very, very muscle intensive. After a couple of days it can really start to hurt, and so it is something that requires good core strength, good length strength, and a decent amount of practice, but the basics of it can be achieved in a few hours. I would just recommend thoroughly stretching beforehand if you want to be able to get out of bed the next day. The other thing to remember is your arm position. If you imagine that when you're on stage, you and the puppet have separate silhouettes, that's the goal. Because oftentimes an audience member, if you imagine the scale of, say, the Old Vic stage, if you're all the way up in the rafters watching something, you're not going to be able to see the detail of a puppet. All you're going to see is the rough shape of a puppet, and therefore it is important to separate your own silhouette from the puppet by keeping it as far away from your body as possible while still being in safe control of it. So you want to keep your arms as straight as possible and as far away, and your hands as far out from the body as possible, so to separate these two silhouettes. However, in some situations this can change. So I remember I saw Brunskill and Grimes, this puppet company who I really love, recommend go and follow them on Instagram. They do some really cool stuff. They produced this bear puppet for one of the productions of the National Theatre, and it was actually operated by someone sitting inside of it. So this is not necessarily true for all puppets, but for puppets on a smaller scale, generally you want to keep them as far away from your body as possible. Next up would be how to bring a puppet alive. So there's kind of three key steps that I like to think about when you are bringing a puppet to life. So the first thing is its weight. When you're working with paper puppets, like we were going to when we were building snakes, oftentimes they will have very little weight to them because they are made out of just paper and oftentimes gaffer tape or duct tape. You actually need to bring that weight. So imagine when a mime convinces the audience that there's a giant invisible box that they can't possibly move. It's a similar sort of technique in puppetry. So you've got to convince the audience that the object has weight. So for example, there are different ways to puppet when you've got something that's meant to be very heavy and slow moving versus something, say, like a ghost that has no weight at all. And so it's important to work out where the weight comes from and how you generate that. So for example, a lot of the times in humans, the weight is borne by our legs, and so you might move the legs more slowly if they're a bit overweight, or if they're a small child they might move very quickly, or say for example, what if they've got a disability, how does that impact the way that they walk, because they might have to put weight more on one foot than the other. These are all interesting things that really make the puppet come alive. The next thing is breath. Breath is not an exclusive to every single puppet. For example, like say a robot doesn't breathe, but all creatures or all things that are alive have some small little bit of movement in them pretty much at all times that indicates that they are still alive and haven't suddenly reverted back to being an inanimate object that really a puppet actually is. So for example, in a human we breathe in and then we breathe out. And it's important to work out how this happens in a puppet, because it is one of the key signs that a human will look for when they're looking for somebody that looks to be alive. And lastly, the thing is, how does it perceive the world? So traditionally this is done through sight. So we have two eyes, animals have eyes of varying degrees of quality. And so often they'll have a head which then moves around with those eyes in it, and you'll be moving that head around to demonstrate where the animal is looking and conversely where the audience should be looking. It's important at this point to make sure that your eye contact is always on the puppet and not the thing that the puppet is looking at, because oftentimes audience members will clue in on where you are looking more than the puppet, because we are hardwired to look for eye contact in humans. And so making sure that you don't deviate your eye contact from the puppet, make sure that the focus, as it should be, is on the puppet and not on your puppetry. At the end of the day, you are hoping that the puppet looks as good as possible, and you should fade somewhat into the background. That's the goal anyway. But there are other ways that a puppet can perceive the environment. So for example, it might see only by smell or sound, and it's interesting to work out how does that change the way in which a puppet will move. So for example, if an actor stays very, very quiet, a puppet which has no eyes might be able to see it, and it's interesting to see how that changes the performance as it is. And those are some kind of basic techniques. There are endless kinds of puppet that I could spend a lot more time going into, but they're beyond the scope of this video. There's a bunch of videos in the description below that are really, really good resources from a bunch of different people as to like how to build a puppet, how to operate a puppet, what are the key things about a puppet that I learned a lot from, and I hope that you can too. As you develop your skills, you'll move from simply using, say, a jumper or a bit of paper to make into a puppet, and moving on to building full-scale puppets that are these massive creations that look like dragons or something fantastical, and that can be really fun. But also there is so much joy in just seeing how a book comes to life, and that's why I find puppets really interesting, and I hope that through this video you guys will start to explore it and enjoy it as much as I do. That's everything I've got for you today. Hope you enjoyed, and stay safe, and I'll see you later.